be a state and play a specific role intervening into international affairs. These themes will be taken up by Ray Bassett, who is the former ambassador of Ireland to Canada and a long-serving diplomat, and also, of course, one of the key civil servants involved in the Good Friday Agreement process. And he'll be looking particularly at the questions that arise from that in terms of this overall debate in relation to the principle of consent, what that means in reality, and what sort of activity, therefore, is part of the context. Again, with the aim of, is it a united Irish Republic or just a union of territory, which we have in mind. And the final speaker in this session will be Dr. Ian Malcolm, who's a tutor in Irish in Stranmillis College in Belfast. Ian comes from a Protestant and indeed a unionist background, though I think he would describe his background as liberal unionist more than any other type. But he's been an important figure in explaining the actual history and depth of connections of the Protestant community to the Irish language over the centuries. And of course we know the role played by the Presbyterian Church in developing Irish as part of the requirements for their ministers in the early years. So he'll be looking at cultural questions. Some years ago, just personally speaking, I wrote a pamphlet, I say some years ago, about 50 years ago, I wrote a pamphlet called Culture and Revolution in Ireland, and building on the fact that the words Ireland Éireann had been put up on an orange order lodge banner, I rather rashly made the comment that perhaps the cultural and linguistic bridge might be one of the easiest to build, given the rows of conspoid which has arisen over the question of an Irish Language Act and the dour opposition of the DUP towards it. Perhaps I was a little bit premature in that analysis. We'll see what Ian has to say about that. So those are the themes which we'll be looking at, and we'll have a discussion. I'm asking each of the speakers to keep their initial contributions to about 20 minutes plus a little bit, and then we'll have an open discussion and try and draw some ideas together. So the first speaker, as I say, will be Dr. Karen Devine, a lecturer in international relations and EU affairs at Dublin City University. And as I said, she'll be addressing in particular the issues of European integration, integration of security and defence policy. So could I ask you then to welcome Dr. Karen Devine.
You'll have to come down here, I think.
And to project?
No, I think you'll have to come down here, I think. You have to bring the podium and the microphone down here, you see.
Okay.
And then,
I think that's probably safer for me.
yeah, exactly, yeah.
And what's the
Nobody else?
to move PowerPoint onto that? It's plugged in, but
But has it appeared on the screen?
it's on my screen.
Yeah, I
just
think-
need to get
yeah.
it onto that screen.
Yeah, you'll have to come forward a bit, Karen.
Is there any assistance in terms of getting it?
Has the guy gone, are you connected up or not? Yeah, and has it appeared on your screen?
It has.
Yeah, no.
It's here.
To be honest with you, no, I don't know. See, I think you have to be connected.
hang on, let's see.
No, you are connected up now.
Let's see. So, I'm just trying to, does it go to external duplicate or second screen?
I'd say open.
That's not strange.
No PowerPoint on.
I see, I don't think the projector's turned on.
No, that's a problem.
Is it possible to get the stick to press the on button on it?
I mean, it's not turned on up there, like.
Yeah, it's not turned on there,
Okay.
no. That's it, yeah. So when that changes from red to green, it could be a business.
Or
Oh, it's in green now.
something like that happened there.
No.
You've gone off the screen.
Oh, okay, so.
Ah, so you need to go down this further.
Okay, so, just trying to go for this. Okay, looks like we're in business.
Right.
Does that buy me a little bit of time, quarter to three,
Yeah.
chairperson? Okay.
We won't take it out of your time.
So, it's a tiny bit missing. I might just pull it down a little bit more. Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak at the Grew School. Can everyone hear okay?
No. The mic's not up, right?
Use the microphone.
You don't need it.
Yeah, can everyone hear now? Is that better?
Yeah.
Yeah. So thank you very much to Owen for the generous introduction. So my name's Karen Devine. I'm a lecturer in European Union politics, Irish foreign policy and gender as well at DCU. So I'm very pleased today to talk about what you can see on the pamphlet, which is how the European Union has progressed towards a European army, a European defence fund, and full-scale, high-intensity, as they call it, military operations, which is also known to most people in the street as war. I'll look at Irish neutrality and how the government have created an alternative discourse that is running counter to public preferences. This alternative discourse is on something they call military neutrality, whereas Irish people adhere to neutrality. And there's a massive difference between the two concepts. There's basically three questions, and the third question that I'm going to look at is the part of what are the alternatives for the Irish people to pursue, particularly in the context of the war in Ukraine. So those are the three questions: how and why have successive Irish governments acquiesced to the EU demands for a common defence and to get rid of neutrality? How embedded Ireland is in the common security and defence policy. We signed up to PESCO, and then last year we signed up to something called what the EU euphemistically labels a peace fund, which again, when you hear the EU or the Irish government talking about a peace facility or peace fund or peace support operations, just substitute the word war. Okay? So this is the wordsmithing that's going on. How have Irish politicians kept this hidden from the Irish public via this wordsmithing? And what are the alternatives? So, do you know what? I'm just going to give you all the answers right up front. So I've only got 20 minutes. So the first answer is, how has the Irish government acquiesced? Well, there's a huge lack of political accountability of governments at the EU level. So once power is transferred up to the EU level, ministers can decide what they want in the Council of Ministers, and there's no public oversight. They make decisions behind closed doors. The European Parliament all along was supposed to have a role of oversight in relation to the European security and defence policy. As far as back in the 90s, then MEP Francesca Rossa said, look, I'll only vote for these successive treaties coming down the line, deepening European integration, if the EU Parliament has a role. It has no role whatsoever. It gets a 6-monthly update from whatever the President of the EU or the High Representative for Common Foreign Security Policy of the EU deems fit to say. So there's absolutely no accountability, and that is a huge problem. Corruption, which I will go into, in terms of French and German premiers in particular. If you do your research, bypass necessarily the usual channels and go straight to sources. You can go to court documents, you can look at some official information on, for example, Nicolas Sarkozy, Jacques Chirac, Mitterrand, past French presidents and premiers. If you look at Angela Merkel, Helmut Kohl, Wolfgang Schäuble, all familiar names to us, all implicated in corruption in relation to arms deals, particularly American arms deals. And of course, once you transfer the level of funds, and we're talking 27.5 billion euros from national level to the EU level, there's no parliamentary oversight. Governments can decide what they want, and all of the charges being brought against various premiers will basically not be possible to pursue at the EU level. So they're getting caught at the national level. So the solution, as I see it for them, is to transfer all of this to the EU level where there's no oversight or accountability, so they can continue what they're doing. So I'll just go back to individual politicians' personal political and financial ambitions. A lot of the time when Irish politicians go along with the EU speak, they are rewarded with EU ambassadorships, which are very nicely paid with a nice pension, or they just simply gain power through positions at the EU level. And that is linked to the unwillingness of Irish politicians, not all of them, but the majority. So I'm talking the Labour Party, the Green Party, Fianna Fáil, Fine Gael, to represent the true political preferences of the Irish people in relation to neutrality and European security and defence. And that is linked to a moral and political cowardice and a sheer unwillingness to do the right thing, which ordinary people know. And by lying by commission and lying by omission. So purposely giving misinformation and then also lying by not giving information that should be provided about what's agreed at the EU level and Ireland's involvement. Then we have the mass media's willingness to go along with this. So we used to have some broadsheet newspapers labelling themselves the paper of record, and that ceased back in the 1990s when Sean Flynn was replaced as the Europe editor. And obviously there's a huge lack of critical engagement by the national broadcaster as well. And why do they do it? Well, because they can get away with it. And that's where public opinion comes in. So the answer to the second question, how embedded is Ireland? Well, there's 10 policy reversals. It's going to be included in the slide deck. I don't have time to go through them now, from the 1980s to the 2000s. I have papers on this on my own website, which is www.drkarendevine.com. So you can see all of this information there. Ireland is part of the EU Common Defence by legally committing to the EU's military alliance, which is created through a number of structures, including a mutual defence clause. That was all in the Lisbon Treaty, which Ireland eventually ratified after a second referendum was held. We've also signed up to Permanent Structured Cooperation, also known as PESCO, which is the structures to create an EU military force. We signed up on the 11th of September 2017, and we have proposed to meet, and this is the crucial thing, the EU's so-called level of ambition, and these key terms are very important: level of ambition in military spending and equipment. And this we've seen on the Commission on Defence Forces reports, February 9th, 2022, and a follow-up one on the 13th of July 2022. So the Irish government is working to change Irish public preferences for neutrality and to involve Ireland directly in the war in Ukraine. And this is our Minister for Foreign Affairs and Defence, Simon Coveney, who gave a talk at Harvard University saying these exact same things. I probably have no time left, but I'll see what I can get through in terms of the third part. So Irish politicians have kept this hidden from the Irish public through this wordsmithing that I talked about. So for those who want to try to resist Ireland being made a full member of NATO and getting involved in EU and Western powers wars, what can they do? Well, be aware of the following. Be aware of the difference between the words traditional policy of military neutrality. Okay, when the governments use this, what they mean is joining NATO and being involved in war, which is the opposite of neutrality. Simply neutrality. It's also called active neutrality or positive neutrality, to differentiate it from this mythical military neutrality. You have to be aware of that. So when a politician starts talking about military neutrality, say, hang on, stop. That's not what I'm talking about as someone who lives in Ireland and who votes. I'm talking about neutrality. That's my preference. Manipulation of question wording in opinion polls in neutrality, EU, defence and NATO. I have many examples of this in the deck, but I probably won't have time to get to them. Maybe if there's questions about it, I can show you. And there's a lot of false reporting, then therefore, having manipulated the question wording to try to get a positive response towards NATO membership and Ireland being part of an EU common defence, they then completely mislead in terms of how they write up the results. Again, I have slides on that. And the blanket media anti-neutrality propaganda through the so-called broadsheets that I referred to before, and the national broadcaster. So what else can people do? Well, they can seek certain things, particularly independent evidence-based information on public opinion, on neutrality, on USA and EU war politics from grassroots NGOs, and particularly from non-funded academics. So if you hear on the media, and that's all you will hear on the media, is 25 years of researching and publishing on neutrality. Not once have I been asked onto the media to talk about it. I've made 150 media appearances, but not really on neutrality, and certainly not in the past couple of years. So there is a label called Jean Monnet lecturers, and they are all over the media, and they are invited to speak constantly. So when you hear the word Jean Monnet lecturer, read EU funded, and therefore they're not actually academics. They are pure spokespeople. Original texts, they are available. You can dig for them, and I reference them in every single piece of research. And in terms of voting, who do you vote for? You have to vote for neutrality adherent, again, not military neutrality adherent politicians, and in particular MEPs, and tell them they have to vote to cut the 27.5 billion that has been allocated at the EU level between the years 2021 and 2027 for EU defence, and to stop future expansion of that budget after 2027, and then campaigns. Try and support NGOs, because the grassroots NGOs are really our last option for a vehicle to express public preferences. The media have abdicated, the government doesn't want to know. So there's ones like AFRI, Action from Ireland, PANA, the Peace and Neutrality Alliance, Shannon Watch, Veterans for Peace. Obviously the Grieve School is part of that discourse as well, and discuss and inform peers of EU defence funds, provocation of wars, and the future EU army. So that's basically my talk in a nutshell. And just to say that there's going to be a newly reincarnated Irish Neutrality League. So this was started, I think it was around 1914. James Connolly was involved, Countess Markievicz was involved, a lot of the Easter Rising activists were involved, and that is going to be launched again on the 15th of October 2022, so keep an eye out for that. So we need to become a lot more actively engaged and involved and informed on this, because we're on our own at this point. Okay, so how much time do I have left?
There's another 10 minutes.
Okay, I'll see what I can whiz through. This deck can be made available on the Grieve Summer School website, and there's a Facebook page as well. So how have governments acquiesced to EU demands? So I won't go through this, but just to say it started in 1948 with a military alliance that we are now part of. The EU subsumed the Western European Union through the Lisbon Treaty. It has its satellite centre, it has its Institute of Security Studies, it has its arms group, which has been renamed the European Defence Agency. So all of it we are part of through the Lisbon Treaty. There was a failed attempt at a European defence community in 1952. The Treaty of Rome didn't have any defence implications, but in the series of reports in the 1970s to the 1980s, there was intergovernmental reports saying the EEC, which is just an economic trade community at that point, should have a foreign policy and should have ambitions to intervene in affairs outside of its own borders. Then that led to the Treaty on Maastricht, where it said there will be a common European defence, which we said yes to. It set up a lot of political structures as well for that. The Nice Treaty formalised all of this, the military committee, the military staff and the battle groups. That brings us up to 20 years ago, but a lot more has happened since. What did the Irish government do? Well, in relation to all of these timelines, again, this deck will be available. Essentially what they said was, well, this could be problematic for Ireland, but went along with it anyway. We committed to the Nordic battle groups, we changed our legislation to permit it, etc. I talked about corruption, but just before I get to that, this is Wolfgang Schäuble, who came to Dublin in 1995 and said neutrals have to join NATO. And there was a declaration 12 months after Ireland joined in 1973, which said that the European Economic Community was going to achieve a union. And as part of that union, it will have a common foreign policy, and it will have NATO members' concept of security guaranteed by the nuclear weapons of the United States. So they had these plans for a European Union and a common army right from the start. As I talked about corruption, this is Wolfgang Schäuble, who's been pointed to in the red arrow. Helmut Kohl is there. So the CDU, which is the political party that Angela Merkel has been at the helm at, and has been replaced with recently, but it's all from the same lineage. The CDU party was basically taking illegal monies from arms dealers and funneling it into campaigns so they could overspend what they are legally allowed to do. So this is Helmut Kohl leaving a press conference on the 30th of November. And these are some of the reports. Schäuble got funds from an arms dealer. The German party leader took cash from an arms dealer. So it's there, but it's just not very prominent. And the person who the red arrow is pointing to is Angela Merkel. So Angela Merkel took over after Schäuble, and Kohl resigned, and Schäuble was eventually forced to resign. The CDU party was fined 41 million Deutschmarks because of this corruption. So then I suppose you put that in the context of why is Wolfgang Schäuble telling Ireland that they have to join NATO? You can link it to corruption of one of many variables, but this is what the EU said in relation to Finland and Sweden, and they basically said we are telling Sweden, Finland and Austria, who joined in 1994, drop your neutrality because it's going to be a barrier to our common defence plans. And you can see it here that it better not hamper the possible evolution in time of a common European defence. And the Irish governments knew this back in the early 90s. As I said, French premiers are also involved in arms corruption. This is Nicolas Sarkozy. He's been involved or implicated in Pakistani arms deal corruption, in Libyan arms deal corruption. In the Karachi affair, 6 were sentenced to prison. And then the Libyan campaign cash is still going through the courts. And so you can see there's some political personal motivations to basically move this to the EU level. This is the EU's definition of a common defence, and it just says it's to do with being part of a military alliance through signing the Treaty of Brussels, which is the Western European Union's treaty, which we subsumed through the Lisbon Treaty, and the EU now is part of. And what was our alternative? It was said by politicians in 1939 and in 1955. Essentially, we have to proclaim throughout the world our neutrality, our determination not to be involved in war, to say that we're not lined up and linked with Britain for defence purposes. You can just substitute EU, Western powers, and we have no entangling alliances. In 1955, Amy de Valera said, we would not be wise as a nation in entering into a full-blooded political federation that would involve a military alliance because of the significant likelihood that small states' positions would be ignored. And indeed, they are. Okay, so this is just a couple of bits about, again, timelines. How much time do I have left?
10 minutes.
10, okay. So this is basically Ireland's first address to Dáil Éireann. Time is nicely elastic here. 21st of January 1919. This was a declaration by the first Dáil to say the permanent peace of Europe can never be secured by perpetuating military dominion for the profit of empire. And that's exactly what is happening now. In Jean Monnet, who's argued to be the founding father of European integration, hence the moniker Jean Monnet lectures that we are subjected to in the media ad nauseum. In his memoirs, he said, Europe will be able, with increased resources, to pursue the realization of one of her essential tasks, the development of the African continent. So this peace facility isn't just funding lethal weapons for the war in Ukraine, it's also happening in Mali and other places in the African continent. And this is the launch of PESCO on the 6th of March 2018. Federica Mogherini, that High Representative for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy, I'll just call it High Rep from now on, time considerations. We decided ways to fulfill our level of ambition. It's really important you understand that terminology because it's appeared now in the Irish Defence Forces Commission reports. Okay, the level of ambition, I will come to that, which is very high. We've discussed several missions and operations, Central African Republic, Somalia and Mali, and facility to finance and support our military operations on a broader geographical scope beyond sub-Saharan Africa. So they're very clear when you listen to them what they want this to be. Okay, second part, how embedded is Ireland? Well, this is, I suppose, again, the slides are going to be available. We don't have time to go through it. What I've mapped out here is the Irish government positions on the negotiations on the inclusion of that mutual defence clause that I talked about. That's part of the Lisbon Treaty that came from the Western European Union Military Alliance. And essentially what the Irish government proposed was changing the wording to suggest if a member state is a victim of armed aggression, it can request other member states to give aid and assistance. So it's not an automatic obligation. France, Germany, and then UK, which was a member back then, said no, and all they did was deleted the words military and other from the original clause, which is taken directly from the Western European Union Treaty, called the Brussels Treaty, and just added this so-called Irish clause, it won't prejudice the security and policy of certain member states, which is a meaningless phrase completely. Irish government politicians will say that means neutrality. If it was supposed to mean neutrality, it would say neutrality. It's very easy to put it in a legal text, and there's reasons why they won't. So that's basically where where Martin Mansfield said Ireland's foreign policy tradition is only partly described as neutrality. This is the Lisbon Treaty, agreed. It has a mutual defence clause and a solidarity clause. This is what the EU is proclaiming it onto the stage as, you know, being a good thing because of these things. That's José Manuel Barroso. So what are the past discourses? And this is very interesting because this was in 1999. So the part there, the EU summit in Cologne last June agreed that military planning and cooperation functions of the Western European Union be incorporated into the EU. Ireland is fully involved in the discussions that would like to bring this out, and the transfer of these functions to the EU is expected to be completed by the end of 2000. It was in fact completed through the Lisbon Treaty. But what was said was policy on defence shouldn't be developed on a nod and wink basis. It's trying to be upfront and open, and they still have yet to be. So here it is in the Helsinki summit. This is Bertie Ahern and John Bruton. John Bruton said the EU will use military means force in accordance with the principles of the UN Charter, as the Taoiseach has said. There's absolutely no requirement, however, for prior UN approval. All that is required is that it will be in accordance with the principles of the UN Charter. Another wordsmithing. The UN has nothing whatsoever to do with this, okay? Adherence to the principles of the UN Charter is meaningless. And then following Helsinki, we will share policy responsibility for the mistakes as well as the successes in EU defence policy. In that sense, we will cease to be, and are ceasing to be, neutral. John Bruton, 1999. Okay, so they knew it all along. It's there on the Dáil record. We know that the funding for the Lisbon Treaty basically was 13 times more on the yes side than the no side. And again, manipulation of opinion poll data was involved in that too. The slides are here on it. So what did that lead from the Lisbon Treaty ratification? This is Jean-Claude Juncker in 2015 calling for an EU army. Okay. And this is Ursula von der Leyen, who was German Defence Minister at the moment and who is now head of the European Commission. So she said, our future as Europeans will one day be a European army, and it's to strengthen the European pillar in the transatlantic alliance. And that the EU army was a European vision whose time has come. So this is 2015. Again, more of it in March 2015. Ultimately, this should amount to the European Defence Union, which will support NATO. It's Javier Solana. Here we have Jean-Claude Juncker calling for the end goal of establishing a European army, and so forth. And then we have the actual legal agreement. So it is legislated for. PESCO is a legal framework to jointly plan, develop and invest in armed forces. This is directly from the European Union. The 11th of December 2017, they wanted to create a 5,000 strong army. Here it is again on the 6th of May 2021. The foreign ministers are actually discussing it in council to make an agreement on it. 6th of May 2021. And how embedded are we? Well, there's 48 projects in place by 2020, a couple of years ago. Cooperation as well with the United States and with Norway. And basically PESCO and the proposed multi-billion-dollar European Defence Fund has been created. Angela Merkel's government at the time was given the task of sorting out the issue by the end of the year. So she was determined to make sure this was in place before she left office and that it would continue on. So what will this money do? 27.5 billion, that's a cool amount of money for the defence contractors. So the fund will place the EU amongst the top 4 defence research and technology investors in Europe. So they have it in these different funds. Some are off books, some are on books. This 13 billion euro fund is on books. There's a 6.5 billion fund to modernise Europe's strengthen bridges and stuff so they can move tanks east into the Ukraine. So move troops east in the case of conflict with Russia, known as military mobility, and it's about moving tanks to the front. So it's all there. With an eye on Russia, EU opens a military mobility project. 6th of May 2021, it's actually being put in place. Okay, so this was always leading up to provoking the conflict in the Ukraine. So as I said, on books and off books. So there's this one that was created last year, off books. This is 10.5 billion. I've probably only got a couple of minutes left now, but this is the EU budget, stepping up the EU's role as security and defence provider. So this off books, again, is simply to fund lethal force. Here it is. This is from Joseph Borrell, the EU High Rep, who took over from Mogherini on the 27th of February. We've decided to use our capacities to provide arms, lethal assistance for the Ukrainian army, up to $500 million in the first instance. Everybody agreed, or at least did not obstruct, i.e. Ireland has blood on its hands. Okay, Ireland agreed to this. And then we'll fast forward to Simon Coveney, our Minister of Foreign Affairs and Defence. This is him speaking over in the United States. He said, neutrality means Ireland decides when we got involved and when we don't. In this war, however, quote, Ireland is not neutral. They've said it. Ireland is not neutral. Okay? So what he said was basically, the text is here, the war is changing the debate in Ireland. I think that Irish people will be more open to collective approaches to security. That's again wordsmithery for the army and the defence fund. Ireland has so far refrained from sending military equipment to the Ukraine, but it has sent non-lethal supplies such as medical equipment. Well, that's changed now, because we're part of that $500 million going over to the Ukraine. He actually said in this that the fact that the war is brutal is the reason why Ireland cannot be neutral. But for public opinion, the fact that wars are brutal is the very reason why Ireland has to be neutral. So the government is now using the very reasons why Irish people want neutrality to say Ireland should not be neutral, for those very reasons. Talk about, what's the word, gaslighting. It's psychological abuse at a mass level. We are a complete outlier on what we spend on defence, so that's the last bit I'm just going to show this level of ambition stuff. And we're a complete outlier in what we spend on defence. He said in the same talk, I don't believe that's sustainable in the future, because he said it's roughly quarter to half of what other similar sized countries in Europe are spending. So he's not only saying that because wars are brutal, Ireland cannot be neutral, and therefore we should send billions to increase the lethality of the war in Ukraine so that there will be more mass graves and more civilians killed. Okay? Now we need to transform and look at what the government reports have said, and this is what the government reports have said. So Ireland's embeddedness here, and this is this Commission on Defence Forces, this is reported in the Irish Times, and they're saying under level of ambition 2, okay? What is this level of ambition? It's an entirely new discourse, and as you can see, it is downloaded from the EU directly. So this is no longer the Irish Defence Forces Commission report, this is the EU. Entirely the EU's level of ambition. Aircraft should be capable of deploying overseas and providing armed supports to troops. That is what you need to have a war. So these are these levels of ambitions. So this is the 13th of July response to the February report in 2022. Level of ambition 1, current capability. So at the lowest level, 1. And it says to aim to uphold sovereign rights serving on peace support operations to the same extent as present. But hang on a second, peace support operations, aren't we doing UN peacekeeping? Isn't this what the cornerstone of Irish neutrality is? The UN doesn't do peace support, it does peacekeeping. As I said, peace support is just a euphemism for war. So there's no UN and there's no peacekeeping in this. Those words are now completely gone from all government discourses on defence. This is key. The second part is building on our current capability to address priority gaps and our ability to deal with an assault on Irish sovereignty. From whom? When? How? It's never defined. What is the threat? So we have higher intensity peace support operations. Higher intensity is just another euphemism for war, right? And then the third level of ambition they call conventional. Conventional, everyday, commonplace, the norm, conventional. Conventional, and this is what Simon Coveney was talking about, conventional is a European Union level of ambition where there's an EU army and there's EU-NATO military cooperation. That's what the government is going to do. Simon Coveney is on record as saying that that's what they're going to do, and our attitudes to neutrality must change. I'd say I'm kind of gone now. This is the third section, yeah. So all I have here is that this is part of the examples of those who are basically telling blatant lies about Irish attitudes to EU defence, saying it's a qualified yes to joining the EU common defence, whatever neutrality is. So there's this long-standing campaign for decades by Jean Monnet academics, supposed academics, trying to say in the media that Irish public opinion on neutrality is confused, that Irish people are supportive of an EU army, and they are not. And no matter what way they spin it, it's just not the case. So this is a question where they said a majority is open to joining an EU common defence. People were asked to consider a statement that Ireland should consider. So they were asked to consider how close are they to a statement about considering something. That was the actual wording. So it's 2 steps removed. I'd like you to consider this statement that Ireland might consider. So people say, well, you can consider away, there's no problem in considering, and they reported it as, hey, guess what? Everyone who said yes wants to join an EU common defence. A blatant lie. So I kind of run out of time. This is just to say these are the elements of the public concept of neutrality, which is neutrality, not military neutrality. The government are trying to say the public's concept of neutrality is not active neutrality, but is in fact military neutrality. The data shows that to be false. We have been supportive and always are supportive of the EU. We're at the top of that. But we are always at the bottom of support for a common army, a European defence. So yes, people are supportive of the EU. No, people are not supportive in Ireland of an EU common defence. These are all of the surveys from 1981 up until 2013, and even more recently, to the present year, 70% of voters are against Ireland joining NATO. Overwhelming support for the retention of Ireland's military neutrality. No, again, it's neutrality. And just final word. Government have always said, when they've been getting involved in deeper integration, oh, Irish people, look at Sweden, look at Finland, sure, look at what they're doing, and they're neutral, or at least they say they're neutral, but they're not. So what's happening now, in terms of how Ireland is going to proceed, just look at Sweden, look at Finland, because they have actually applied to join NATO, and that application was accepted on the 16th of May, and now that application has to be ratified by other members of NATO. And then Sweden and Finland will be part of NATO, and that is exactly where the Irish government is going to press us to go. So the last thing to say is our conclusions. We are fully embedded, without question, in all of the EU military structures and the future 5,000 strong EU army. We are now left with all of the major political parties are supporting this, but are lying to the Irish people about their support for it. So we're left with smaller parties, People for Profit, Richard Boyd Barrett, Ainsley Tobin, the only ones who actually talk about neutrality. And Thomas Pringle, Catherine Connolly, like independent TDs, and then some of the MEPs like Luke Mean Flanagan, Claire Daly, Mick Wallace. So it's really up to the public to lobby their politicians and their MEPs and to say we don't want to be in NATO, we want to retain neutrality, not military neutrality, and we are not willing to be part of the EU's imperialist adventures in Africa or in Europe. Thank you.
Using this as well, yeah?
Yeah,
You'll be. Okay, well, thank you very much, Karen. That was a generous 20 minutes, by the way, and there's no guarantee that that generosity will be maintained in the future. But our next speaker, drawing on these themes, it leads us into the question, post-Brexit, where do we stand vis-a-vis EU, Irish neutrality, all these types of questions. And what are most importantly, given the problems which are arising from implementing Brexit and their impact upon us, how do we deal with the issues that have arisen over the protocol, and in particular behind that and in the overall context, what are the actual issues involved in the principle of consent? And that is the area in which Dr. Ray Bassett, the former Irish ambassador, member of the team for Irish civil servants involved in getting the negotiations through on the peace process. And I'd like Dr. Bassett now to address it.
thanks very much. For me, Margaret.
Just press the right arrow key to move it on. So this one here. At the bottom.
So,
Yeah.
okay. Thank you very much, Gurmil Margaret. And thanks. It's very hard to follow Karen. So I'll do my best. Okay, I'm going to talk today essentially about the principle of consent. And principle of consent and the whole issue of self-determination has traditionally in Ireland been a very contentious issue. What is the unit for deciding self-determination? And the traditional Irish Republican or nationalist view is it's the whole island of Ireland. And the whole island of Ireland is the point at which we make decisions on issues relating to sovereignty and that. And looking through the kind of papers at the time, the arguments was that, you know, around 1920 and after that, there was no argument about nationality. Nobody in Ireland was saying in 1920 they weren't Irish. I mean, even Carson said, I was born an Irishman and I'll die an Irishman. There was no physical division between the islands, so they were continually based their argument that there wasn't any way that you could create a subdivision. And of course, when the idea of the subdivision came up, it was contentious also as to what the subdivision was. It was clear, you know, in the early 20th century that the government in London was prepared to, partly because of pressure in Britain as well, to meet the desire of a majority in the province of Ulster not to join a home rule. And the first real contentious area was, if you're going to opt out, how do you do it, on what basis? And John Redmond, who was an arch-imperialist, and in fact, even after Home Rule, wanted to continue to have Irish MPs at Westminster, proposed that the kind of point of division should be each individual county, so that each individual county could have a plebiscite to decide whether it would join a new free state or a new southern state or stay with a northern state. And that was rejected. And it caused a lot of aggravation. That, in other words, was it going to be a 9-county, was it going to be a 6-county, or was it going to be a 4-county? If there had been a free decision, it would have ended up as 4-county, because neither Fermanagh nor Tyrone had any desire, at the majority there, to go into the new state in Northern Ireland. And in fact, reading through the papers, it's clear that there was a huge desire to try and lessen violence, and there was a decision sometimes in the British Parliament that the Unionists of Fermanagh and Tyrone were more violent than the Nationalists. So it's actually written down in some of the papers, so it might be as well, we might have less trouble forcing the Nationalists in than the Unionists. Now that caused great bitterness, because the first thing the new Stormont did was they abolished they suspended local government in Fermanagh and Tyrone, and shortly afterwards, despite what was said in the treaty, the Stormont government also abolished proportional representation and sat about in those counties, sitting down and making up a completely new set of constituencies which greatly favoured one side. So there was very little generosity on either side, and the Irish government, particularly when De Valera came in, totally rejected the idea that Northern Ireland had a right to its own decision making. And it's very starkly put in the 1937 Constitution, which bluntly states in Article 2, the national territory consists of the whole island of Ireland and its territorial seas. There's no ifs, buts, or grey areas in it. Let's press this. Is that, oh sorry, how do I get it back?
Yeah, you just press the back button.
Okay, that went on, but on the British side and the Northern Ireland side, the tendency right from the very start was to place the expression of consent in the Parliament of Northern Ireland. And the Ireland Act 1949 said that in no event will Northern Ireland or any part thereof cease to be a part of His Majesty's dominions and of the United Kingdom without the consent of the Parliament of Northern Ireland. Now that looks quite democratic, and in fact there would be a strong majority maintaining it. But if you look at the Stormont elections, between a third and a half of the constituencies weren't even contested because of the very, very unfair method of drawing up the constituencies. And of course, as I said, at this stage, the proportional representation would have been gone. If you read through the files, you can see that Attlee and Bevan were quite anti-Irish Catholic under it. And they were showing very little sympathy. But also we had a foreign minister by the name of Sean McBride. And Sean McBride seemed to almost be a bull in a china shop, and because he seemed to upset the apple cart everywhere. One of the funniest instances was reading in the old files in the embassy in Ottawa that he wrote to Lester Pearson, who was the Foreign Minister of Canada at the time. Lester Pearson is 100% Irish. His family are from Dublin and Kilkenny. He tried every time he could, both as Foreign Minister of Canada and later as Prime Minister, to be helpful. But MacBride wrote to him demanding that Pearson ended partition. I could just imagine the letter arriving in the Foreign Minister, in the External Ministry in Canada. But also going through the files on issues relating to consent, one of the strangest things that I've discovered from reading Irish government files is Winston Churchill. Winston Churchill has whimsical attempts. He sent this telegram to Eamon de Valera on the 30th of November. Congratulations on your 78th birthday. May we live to see the unity of Ireland restored. Now, partly it was because Churchill, who was Prime Minister of Britain, wanted to visit Ireland. He, if you read his books, his early memories are Dublin when he was in the Phoenix Park. He was very heavily involved with the Dublin Fusiliers, but De Valera was having none of it and really didn't want it to come true. It's a theme that I feel from my own time in working in government is a good relationship at the top of government is hugely important. Things get done on that. Now, the period after this was a very stale period. Ireland was in a very bad economic, the Southern Ireland was in a very bad economic situation in the 50s. And in 1961, they got the fright of their lives when they found out that Macmillan had applied for membership of the EEC. They had no interest whatsoever in the EEC. You can read that in the files. And suddenly Whittaker, who was a very, very bright civil servant, said, and he says, it will be a catastrophe if Ireland is outside the EEC and Britain's inside, because we'll never get our cattle across to Britain. So he more or less took Lamass and all of them and started saying, you're going to be great Europeans. And that's the origin of our devotion to Europe, and it has never got out of the DNA since. That, you know, we had nothing to offer. The British had a huge market. They were a wealthy country. Ireland was a poor agricultural country. The EEC didn't really want us. So Whittaker took a very, very intelligent decision, which was at the time, we go over there and we convince them that we're very, very strong Europeans. And he had to spend time with the politicians to get them to do so. Now, at the end of the 60s, obviously, there were cathartic events. There was the arms trial, there was the outbreak of the Troubles, and it caused ruptures in Southern society, which at the initial period of the Civil Rights March was very, very sympathetic, and even in the early start of the Troubles. But then when things got very rough, and when there was a kind of a threat to the stability of the state, people moved away. And so by 1973, I think it was, an Irish government, a Fine Gael-led government, could write, the Irish government fully accept and solemnly declare that there will be no change in the status of Northern Ireland until the majority of the people of Northern Ireland desire a change in that status. The British government solemnly declared that it was and would remain in the policy to support the wishes of the majority of the people of Northern Ireland. It's unusual for a country to give a region its own self-determination, and that has been the policy of the British government right since 1920. Now, we often think of Jack Lynch as a very moderate, but Fianna Fáil didn't really support it. And an amendment, Fianna Fáil, and this is in Jack Lynch's name, declares that the use or advocacy of violence to secure unity is abhorrent to it, reaffirms the inalienable right of the people of Ireland to united Ireland, which was essentially rejecting part of the of Sunningdale, which Liam Cosgrave had signed, along with Ted Heath. Now, fast forward that through, I might talk a little about Charles Haughey was a figure which the Department of Foreign Affairs in Dublin were afraid of. And I remember the fear in 1979, or was it 70 or 80, whenever he came into power, that the general view was the Department of Foreign Affairs had worked very close with Jack Lynch, and Mr. Haughey would come in and sort these people out. and they were worried as to how he would do that. Now, Haughey arrived, and he was much different than what he said he would. He'd be like, you know, he had in Britain his counterpart was Margaret Thatcher. And now I'd been at the 1979 summit. I'd been one of the officials working on the 1979 summit when Margaret Thatcher and Lord Carrington came over. And it was quite clear Margaret Thatcher really didn't have any time for Jack Lynch. Like, it just wasn't big. But Haughey was different. Haughey was an awful lot more intelligent. He was great grasp of detail. He was fairly right-wing in his view. And Mrs. Thatcher took to him immediately in a way that nobody expected it to do so. And I'm just looking for a quote from her here. She said, that the briefing notes she got on Haughey had been completely wrong. You've grossly underestimated this man. This is a great guy. And she signed up for what special arrangements between Ireland and Britain called the Anglo-Irish Council and the Joint Studies. Now, Joint Studies were fairly harmless stuff, because I remember them. I think some of them were about the migration of the Mourne fisheries. In other words, herring between, you know, Scotland in the north and then down to the south. But Haughey and some of his ministers grossly overplayed their hand in that area, and it caused irritation where they were, you know, building this up as something it wasn't. Now, in fact, in the longer term, the start of the work between the Irish and British governments at that level, at a kind of institutional level, led to a much greater understanding of each other, much greater kind of personal relationships and things like that. So it was, but Haughey shouldn't have jumped the gun. But of course, the real rupture came with the Falklands War, where Haughey took a neutral stance, but some of his ministers took a much stronger stance, particularly the Minister for Defence, and made very loud protests over the sinking of the Belgrano, and this caused consternation in Britain, and Mrs. Thatcher essentially decided that, you know, Charlie wasn't worth dealing with anymore. Now, shortly, not too long after that, in the 1980s, if anyone was around like myself, the governments changed so often. It was, you know, Fitzgerald's turn, then Haughey's turn. But anyway, Fitzgerald came in, and building on the kind of joint studies, the people like Robert Armstrong and John Chilcott, Goodall, on our side probably Dermot Nally, others, they started working together, and a deteriorating security situation in Britain, and also the election of Ronald Reagan in the United States. And Ronald Reagan and some of his people around him started asking the British government to, you know, essentially deal with this issue. This issue wasn't going away, and we've got to do something about it. So the Anglo-Irish Agreement was negotiated. Article 1, the two governments affirmed that any change in the status of Northern Ireland would only come about with the consent of a majority of the people of Northern Ireland, recognise the present wish of a majority of the people of Northern Ireland is for no change in the status of Northern Ireland, declare that in the future the majority of people of Northern Ireland clearly wish for and formally consent to the establishment of the United Ireland. They will introduce and support in the respective parliaments legislation to give effect to that wish. As you can see, it's a lot of it more developed than Sunningdale. People often say the Good Friday Agreement is a Sunningdale for slow learners. There's no comparison. Sunningdale was basically the back of an envelope, a few things on it. Anglo-Irish Agreement was a much more, the Anglo-Irish Agreement was a much bigger document, and you're beginning to flesh out some of the things that were put in as concepts at the time. Now, Charles Haughey was not impressed, and he rejected the Anglo-Irish Agreement quite vehemently, and he sent, I was in the Department of Foreign Affairs, so we were kind of trying to counter this, and he was sending his former ministers and various all over the United States and other places to try and work up opposition to it. But the trump card for those who support the Anglo-Irish Agreement was the Unionist reaction. So the minute the Unionist reaction, it's an unfortunate thing, but Unionists really went mad on the Anglo-Irish Agreement. So, you know, within nationalist communities in the North and in the United States, people say it mustn't be all that bad. If the other community takes it so badly, there must be something in it for us. In fact, Brian Feeney, then in the SDLP, who later has become one of their arch critics, wrote that the reaction on the ground persuaded Sinn Féin to adopt its abstentionist policy. And you know, at that stage I was working entirely in relation to Northern Ireland. I never wanted to work, by the way, on issues relating to Northern Ireland, because my family is split between Belfast, Dublin and Derry, and it's not a good place to be if you've got family members ringing up and haranguing you. So, but that's just an aside. Now, Gerry Adams, the formal recognition of the partition of Ireland is a disaster for the nationalist cause. It far outweighs the powerless consultative powers given to Dublin. But at the same time, on the ground, and I could hear it myself, the IRA saying, we were the ones responsible for bringing the Good Friday, the Anglo-Irish Agreement. So they were saying, what they were saying wasn't commuting with what one side was saying, this is useless, but the other side of the organisation and in the areas where they were very strong, they were claiming responsibility. They were claiming that they were the ones that without their activity and without the military campaign, there would have been no Anglo-Irish Agreement. And to be, as I say, on the ground and in the United States, the Anglo-Irish Agreement was much more popular than it is today. And people should almost forget that in the immediate elections after the Anglo-Irish Agreement, Sinn Féin was pushed back by the SDLP, and you know, it was clear there was support. One of the things was that under that agreement we set up a place in Maryfield, in which I was in at different times, constantly harassed by George Seawright and several others, but we began to find that the Republicans, even though there was formally an embargo in dealing with Sinn Féin, and that Republicans were starting to use the mechanisms under the Anglo-Irish Agreement. Under the Anglo-Irish Agreement, there were regular meetings, even daily, maybe weekly, in Belfast or in Maryfield, which is in Hollywood, on issues relating to Northern. So, for instance, if a person felt that there was harassment by the security forces in an area in Toonbridge or something like that, they would contact the Secretariat or contact their public representatives. So we began to realise that Sinn Féin and the Republican movement were using the mechanism. In fact, the bulk of complaints we were getting in was from them. So it definitely had an effect in shifting them along the lines. And then the next crisis was when Haughey came back, and I'll show you how paranoid the Department of Foreign Affairs was. We had no ambassador in London at the time, and I remember somebody suggested they fly me over to London because he was only passing through, and Haughey would demand all the courtesies. And somebody said, your accent won't antagonise him. So they were afraid that somebody who had a slightly more, shall we say, educated or less colloquial accent. So I had to go to the airport with one or two, shake his hands and walk him from one plane to the other. And in fact, he was quite reasonable. But there was such fear. I mean, the Secretary of the Department of Foreign Affairs left before he arrived. The Secretary of the Department of Justice left when he arrived. Now, Haughey was not keen on operating the Anglo-Irish Agreement. Anyone who's ever had meetings with him or anything like that, he made it very, very clear. And the main reason he did was the issue of consent. He said Northern Ireland does not have the right to self-determination, and it violated the Constitution. Now, Haughey was hemmed in a lot because the United States, and Reagan was still there at the time, made it very clear that, you know, they were very interested in him operating it. So he reluctantly engaged in it, but he made it very clear that he didn't like it. Now, Haughey's family were from Swatra, County Derry, so he brought a lot of kind of his own personal background onto that, and felt that he would be letting down his family if he did. Actually, an interesting thing is, I think Haughey's first cousin of Monica McWilliams. Charlie's mother was a McWilliams. But it was the issue of consent which he essentially wrote. And we were not going to get any further with changing or making it along like that. It was actually a very interesting time in Anglo-Irish relations because we had no friends in London. And again, I was sent over to Westminster to try and make friends with the nationalist MPs from Scotland and Wales. And Clyde were very, very friendly, David Wigley and those, but the SNP didn't want to know us because there was too much associated with violence and with, you know, Haughey was an over figure in Britain. The one thing that came out was we got great relations with the Isle of Man. The Isle of Man government were delighted we took some interest in. That's a total and utter irrelevancy. One guy who was very, very friendly and very useful was Charles Kennedy, who eventually became leader of the Liberal Party of Britain, who started off as a Scottish nationalist. His family are originally from Ireland, but I remember he was an MP from Rosscromarty and Skye, and he told me that his constituency would not wear an MP who was very, very sympathetic to issues in Ireland. So he said, look, privately I'll do anything, but don't ask me to put my head above the parapet because I won't, you know. And Charles was very nice, and unfortunately he succumbed to alcoholism. He spent a lot of time in Ireland and became very friendly with one of our ministers, George Birmingham, who eventually became a judge. Now, that continued, and interestingly enough, there was a lot of activity on the ground where talking to people were talking. Haughey was hypersensitive of being caught talking to the IRA, even though we basically knew that the British were talking to the IRA, and there was we had a lot of channels going on. But I think the arms trial and a few others made him step back. So he used a lot of intermediaries, particularly using the monastery in Clonard and various others. So there was messages passing backwards and forwards, but I don't think Haughey could have taken it any further. And he was constitutionally and mentally incapable of accepting the principle of consent. So then there was a palace coup, and Albert Reynolds came in. Yeah? You want me to wrap it up?
Yes, please. Yeah.
10 more minutes. Reynolds had
Following the spirit of compromise.
Reynolds had no Anglophobia, and another important thing is he was a very, very close personal friend of John Major, and they developed this at European meetings. Actually, another aside is that when Reynolds developed Alzheimer's, Major was a visitor. You know, there was nothing in it for him, he was afterwards, so it was genuine on that. And that brought us on to British-Irish Agreement. Sorry, have we got the Downing Street Declaration? Yeah, Downing Street Declaration, which Fianna Fáil got. So that was another big chunk of people accepting the principle of consent. Made it clear the people of Ireland and them alone to decide the future, and commits the British government to support whatever choice is made. It also states that the decision of the Irish people that self-determination shall be exercised separately in the two jurisdictions. Major reiterate on behalf of the British government that they had no selfish, strategic or economic interest in it, and that was really the catalyst for bringing the IRA in. And we had said to the Republican movement that they had to accept the principle of consent. But the argument was, it wasn't that the British were forcing the consent on us, it was that the Irish people as a whole have decided, since they have the right of self-determination, that determination should be exercised in the two jurisdictions. It was a way of getting around it. Then the British-Irish Agreement, which is really the formal name of the Good Friday Agreement. The only people who ever signed the Good Friday Agreement was the British and Irish governments. No, I've seen stuff going around, including in the Ulster Museum in Stranmillis. There's actually, it says this is a copy of the signed agreement with all the party leaders. Party leaders never actually signed the agreement because, number one, Jerry Adams said he had to bring it back to the men on the tractors, and David Trimble said he'd have to take it back to the Ulster Unionist Council. So that, as I say, this really is what ends the nationalist Ireland's objection to the and that's it. Now, just to talk about the border poll, because a lot of people are asking about the border poll. Secretary of State shall exercise shall exercise power under paragraph 1 of any time it appears likely that a majority of those voting will express a wish that Northern Ireland will cease to be part of the United Kingdom for form part of the United Ireland. The word shall was put in. I spent a long time discussing that and putting it in. What you wanted to do was to show that this was not a totally discretionary power, but at the same time, the only people who would really call it would have been the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland. And remember who the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland was Mo Mowlam at the time. So that made it much easier to accept. Now, just on the 7 years was an interesting one because there was an argument in the discussions. The original papers had 5 years, and some Irish government advisor got 10 years, and the Irish side got into a long argument, and the British suddenly said 7 years. So there is no magic figure about 7. It was purely given across as you were trying to finish the drafting of the agreement. Just to say, Raymond McCord, I was involved in this case because I gave a deposition for Raymond McCord, and that has looked from a legal point of view as to what McCord, whose son was killed in very tragic circumstances, asked the High Court to demand that the Secretary of State spell out the conditions under which the cause were upheld. And the High Court, and it was referred to the Supreme Court in Britain, who sent it back, so it means that they agreed with it. The Secretary of State has considerable discretion in calling a board of law. In other words, there's lots of evidence that they can come in. But they said the power under the Northern Ireland Act cannot be exercised in a dishonest manner. So, in other words, Secretary of State just can't say, I'm not doing it. There has to, in the end, when it comes to it, they will have to do it. And the Irish Constitution, born on the island of Ireland, which includes the islands and territorial seas. Furthermore, the Irish nation cherishes its special affinity with people of Irish ancestry abroad. It was actually David Trimble which partly brought the bottom part of that around, because he was objecting to the new Articles 2 and 3 in that he felt that that if we said everybody was an Irish citizen of the island of Ireland, he said, well, one of the other articles says that the Irish state demands fealty. So he said, I could be tried for treason because I'm not fealty. So we tried to expand that by including the people abroad, people in South Boston and various things like that, which has been very useful because a whole new government policy has been developed on the basis of that. But also we did it on saying that it was an entitlement to citizenship. So nobody's formally an Irish citizen when they're born on the island of Ireland. Don't ask me, the lawyers spent hours and hours arguing it. It's the firm will of the Irish nation in harmony and friendship to unite the people who share the territory of the island of Ireland. It's all its diversities, blah, blah, blah. Recognise that a united Ireland will only be brought by peaceful means and the consent of the majority of people, democratically expressed in both jurisdictions, which is now part of the Irish Constitution. So virtually everybody in Ireland accepts the principle of consent, apart from some people in Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil, who were founded on the basis of healing the partition, but nowadays have become so comfortable with the present arrangement that they're talking about that this can't be done on one person, one vote. We've come right 180 degrees. Good meal, Margaret.
Thank you, Ray. I don't believe we need this screen for the next thing, so we'll be able to have a more straightforward approach. Could I just say thank you very much. That brings us to one of the key questions. It's worth noting in all the examples we've been given that the principle of consent was of a majority. It wasn't for different sections coming together, it was a majority. But having said that, we all know James Connolly's famous remark, Ireland without its people mean nothing to me. And the question which we have, which goes I think beyond the issue of a majority, which is coming undoubtedly, is Ireland in the future, a united Irish Republic, will undoubtedly be much, much stronger if we have the willing, active and enthusiastic participation in it of the Protestant section of our people in the north. And we have to therefore look at the ways, what are the issues which particularly concern the northern Protestant community? What are the things that can be done? And perhaps one of the most important questions, the question of our language, our culture, which are indeed the building blocks of identity, and how can we express them? What do they mean? How does that play out on the ground? We know that there are people very heavily involved in Irish language issues from the Protestant community, and one of our speakers, Dr. Ian Malcolm, is one of those. He has written, I think, a very important book, Protestants and the Irish Language, which I believe there's only about 100 copies left, so if you want one, you best hurry up. This is an important book because it shows this is part of the inheritance of the Protestant community in the North, something the DUP, of course, downplays, but how does it work out on the ground? So in that regard, perhaps I'd like to ask Ian if he could give us his contribution. It's well known that I'm a neutral on most issues, but I'm a terrible bigot in favour of the Irish language, so generosity may well be the keynote of the next performance.
I'm going to have to dry my hands first of all. That bottle of Sprite was rather warm and a little more explosive than I'd planned for, so I don't want to smudge my speech. Anyway, go away, that's an intro Josh Shin. Smishy and Malcolm, Togam o Hushkarin, say Tashkil, Day o Tushkadu, Ogam Dave and you. So, my name's Ian Malcolm, I'm from the Black North, and I bring with me to Dublin a message today, along with hundreds and thousands of Garth Brooks fans who give my journey down today very, very comfortable, I have to say. Anyway, I was asked a question the other night by a friend who has devoted many, many years to peace building in between the two communities in Northern Ireland. She's worked at both a national level, but I would know her primarily through her efforts on a more local level in a small town, my own town in County Armagh, Lurgan. Anyway, her question really threw me. Why would loyalists want to learn Irish? And it's a question I've been asked before, and I think I've rehearsed my answers many, many times, but this didn't satisfy her. Every time I came back with an answer, she threw the question back at me again. But Ian, why do working class loyalists not learn the Irish language? Again, I thought I tried to respond as best I could. She asked the question again, and then she completely wrong-footed me by asking me, Ian, what's in it for them? What's in it for a loyalist who wants to learn the Irish language? And I'm going to use that then as my starting point today. Why indeed should loyalists learn Irish? But I'm going to take us on a broader journey around cultural and political aspects of life in Northern Ireland, specifically from a PUL, Protestant Unionist Loyalist viewpoint. That's my background, of course. No, I would describe myself as Unionist rather than Loyalist. Anyway, I am indeed Protestant, British, Unionist, and I'm proud of all those things. But I'm also an Irish speaker, and I'm very, very proud of that too. I work as an Irish language tutor, lecturer, I work at Stranmillis, and I teach a lot of classes privately, so if anybody wants classes, you can give me a shout at the end of the talk. But I also work as a commentator in the Irish language media. I started off my career as a journalist working through the English language, but over the years that's transformed to work exclusively through the medium of Irish now, and I'm very, very proud to do that. Not in the Orange Order, but I'm no stranger to the inside of an Orange Hall or two, as I've been in to sing a song now and again. And in fact, this morning, to try and avoid all the Garth Brooks fans, I went into what for me is the greatest Orange Hall in the country, the GPO on O'Connell Street. Why is it the greatest Orange Hall in the country? Because about 5 years ago, on Easter Monday, I actually sang an Orange song in the GPO. It was closed, but I had quite an interesting little audience there. So that was one of my proudest claims to fame. You will notice, by the way, I have a ukulele with me. With your permission, and the permission of the chairman, hopefully I'll be able to do a wee tune for you at the end, which might take some of you by surprise. Anyway, me and Irish. Right, being a Protestant, you don't get a chance to learn Irish in Northern Ireland. It's not taught in schools. But I was lucky in that my father had a few words of Irish, still does. He's now 86, we celebrated his birthday the other day. He was very, very grumpy, so deliberately we went and gave him a piece of cake which had the big smile on because we made him extra grumpy. But anyway, he had a few words of Irish which inspired me. Little things like Hawaii, good night, Collie Sav. Also, he was very familiar with Irish place names. So if, for example, I'm from Lurgan, if we were driving through Armagh or Portadown, I would say, Daddy, what does Portadown mean? Daddy, what does Armagh mean? And he was able to explain those things to me. So that, in a way, built the magic of the language for me. I think I realised that there was more, that English was not the only language that we have. And I began to realise that the Irish language was all around me. Now, it was many years before I got the opportunity to realise my ambition to learn Irish properly. I started to attend an education class at Queen's in Belfast. And the rest really is history. I went on, did an I went on, got A levels to get myself, this was as an adult. Went on, did a couple of A levels to get myself into university. I was working full time, studying full time, and a single time and a full time single parent as well. So life is pretty tough, but I did that. And then I was offered the opportunity to do a PhD on Protestant attitudes towards the Irish language. But I want to talk about the reactions that I encountered as a Protestant Irish speaker. There were suspicions on both sides, and these depressed me greatly. I wasn't expecting that everybody was going to give me a welcome in the hillsides or the valleys, but the level of hostility at times was quite intense. It was often said to me, Ian, what do you want to go and learn that foreign language for example? That would have come from the Loyalist side. And I was equally disappointed by the Republican response. I thought Republicans would be warmly embracing anybody who wanted to learn the Irish language, particularly perhaps those from the PUL community. But no, again, I can't say I was immediately welcomed into the fold. One example, a guy who I met on a little holiday in the Gaeltacht, got on very, very well with me. He's obviously from a Republican background. I didn't let that interfere with my judgment of him. But he got along well with me until at one stage his sister said to him, oh, by the way, did you know that Ian's a unionist? He turned immediately, just like that, looked round at me and said, his face changed, and he said, I suppose you're in MI5 then? And off he went. And that was the end of it. There was no more Guinness after that, unfortunately, but maybe that's a good thing. Anyway, times they are changing, and it's no longer as unusual as it was in my day for a Protestant to be an Irish speaker. As I said, I teach classes, and I can attest that in the years that I've been teaching, probably when I started, the majority of adults in my classes would have been from a Catholic nationalist background. I would say now the majority would be from the Protestant Unionist background. Certainly, at least it would be at least 50%, but I would imagine that the number of Protestants is slightly greater. But this brings us to a dichotomy which probably chimes very, very well with the theme today. Whenever you look a little bit more, you ask people their names and you find out their addresses, etc. I generally find out a little bit about their education. I generally find that those Protestants who are learning the Irish language would be from a middle class background. It's very, very rarely that I've encountered Protestants from a working class background who are learning the language. And that really is something that we need to address in the future. And I will come to that in my concluding remarks. I'm not going to dwell too much on the Irish Language Act other than to say that perhaps out of step with quite a few in my community, I'm very much in favour of an Irish Language Act. Now I want to take a look back to the foundation of Northern Ireland and the legacy that this has left for unionism, the legacy this created right from the word go in fact. Northern Ireland has always been a contested space with a sullen and resentful minority. And unionism bears a tremendous blame for this because no attempt was made to embrace that minority and encourage them to buy into the concept of Northern Ireland. Unionism has always been reactive rather than proactive as circumstances change. And early leaders were not only remote from the Catholics of Northern Ireland, they were also remote from the working class Protestants of Northern Ireland who could not identify with the tradition of big house unionism. So therefore you had two communities excluded from the union's leadership, and that's why the Labour movement in Northern Ireland did so well in the early days, bringing together working class Protestants and Catholics. Unionism has always been guilty of a lack of outreach, always confident in a majority, and the backstep position has always been, we don't have to do anything. There was no planning for a future where the demographics might no longer be in unionism's favour. They've always been very poor as well at PR. While nationalists and Republicans were cultivating relationships and making friends on the international stage, unionism remained insular. Think of how long it was, in fact, before a senior unionist politician went to the White House on St. Patrick's Day. Just bear with me 1 second. I'm going to have to clear my throat in a rather mega way, so I'm going to move away from the microphone. You wouldn't have liked that microphone, I can tell you. But another factor has been the lack of a political voice for loyalists. We think about the signing of the Good Friday Agreement when David Irvine of the PUP, Gary McMichael of the UDP were there, both representing loyalist parties. So loyalist voices were represented in the negotiations that led up to the Good Friday Agreement, the blueprint for a better future for everyone, for every community in Northern Ireland. What happened then, though, was that the PUP and the UDP disappeared from the stage as they simply could not garner the votes they required from working class loyalists who returned to the mainstream unionist parties. And contrast that with what happened on the Republican side. Sinn Féin brought Republican voters with them at first, and then gradually they were able to bring in nationalist voters as well. And we'll see that process almost complete now. Whereas working class loyalists, many either don't vote or have simply given up on the political process altogether. Now I want to turn briefly to culture as a cause for conflict in Northern Ireland. And every aspect of culture here can be a cause for conflict. I could spend an entire talk on this, but I'd better not. But think about marches. Think about flags, think about language, even think about sport. Think about soccer in particular. Soccer is probably a more working class game than hockey, than rugby, than cricket. And I think it's important in terms of what I'm going to say, because we have two separate bodies for soccer in Ireland, the IFA in the north and the FAI in the south. It was the only sporting body, as far as I know, that took a dual approach at the time of partition. The other sporting bodies managed to maintain one body, one direction, and effectively one team. Also, if any of your followers of ladies football, you might notice that the Northern Ireland soccer team did tremendously well, reaching the European finals earlier this year. So a wonderful achievement. But again, the team is wonderful in that it's made up of girls and women, of course, who are Protestant and Catholic. But it's very, very poignant to watch whenever the national anthem is played that the Catholics don't sing. The captain, a lovely lady called Marissa Callahan, it was very, very clear that while others were singing, she pointedly wasn't. But she's still happy to put on the green shirt and play for the team. But that indicates just how difficult cultural issues are in Northern Ireland. I'm going to give you another sporting example as well. Sometimes there's a lot of tokenism in Northern Ireland, and I think that is shown through in sport as well. Think about the great rivalry between Glasgow Rangers and Glasgow Celtic. I don't know if anybody's ever been over to a big fair match. I don't know, some of you don't really strike me as those who might have ever attended a big fair match. Maybe I'm prejudging here. But obviously the Celts are supported by Republicans to an extent, and Rangers by loyalists. But the great thing is, they're actually supported by ordinary real-life football fans as well. Sometimes, though, it's difficult to tell which is which. Remember years ago in work, there was this guy and he always wore a Rangers shirt, and I took the assumption that, well, okay, he's got to be a Rangers fan. So one particular weekend, Rangers had enjoyed a lovely win, probably over Celtic, maybe 3-0 or something like that. And I said to this guy, hey, you must have been pleased with the match at the weekend. He looked around me and blankly and said, what? I said, you know, the Rangers match. He said, you're wearing a Rangers shirt. And he said to me, Ian, I just wear this to say who I am. And I think we'll see quite a bit of that in Northern Ireland. Anyway, there are so many little things that are controversial and can lead into difficulty. Think about Sinn Féin, IRA commemorations, think about the equivalent on the loyalist side as well. But language is really the one that concerns me, because that's the sector that specifically concerns with me. You know, I have to say that greatly in favour of as Irish as I am. Also think there needs to be recognition given and support given towards Ulster Scots as well. I wouldn't be a great Ulster Scots speaker, but I do speak a few words. However, the whole debate over the Irish Language Commission job has been ugly and without grace on all sides. And I think it shows up that for many people, the Irish language is pure tokenism. There are many Republicans who go, oh yes, we must fight for the right to speak Irish. Whenever I say Kajamara Tatu, or if you love, maybe I better say Constatatu or Ken Kiawiltu, just to cover every dialect, you get a blank look. And that is so disappointing. So for some, tokenism, for others, it's a political football. The Irish Language Act, sadly, is seen as an advance for the Catholic Nationalist Republican community, and it's seen as a backward step for the Protestant Unionist Loyalist community. But remember, in Northern Ireland, we're working on a political zero-sum game. I was going to talk about the role of social media. How am I for time there?
You're a grant.
10 minutes.
Not a problem.
More 10 minutes.
Yeah, another thing that I would like to point out is the role of social media, which in recent years I think has poisoned things and made it much more easy for the lunatics out there to go and poison the political atmosphere. This has been a momentous week, you know, in many ways with the appointment of Liz Truss, but perhaps more importantly, the passing of Queen Elizabeth, or Yeshe Garo Ahanam Uasil. And Irish Twitter, I think, has behaved itself very, very badly. There's a beautiful saying in Irish, one of my favourite proverbs, is bin bell in a hust. And that means if you have nothing constructive to say, just keep your bag shut. In Ulster Scots, that would be rendered as how you're wished. I'm afraid Irish Twitter allowed itself to go mad off the leash this week, and some of the things it's seen were horrible. 20 years ago, that would not have been possible. You couldn't have gone and spread such bile among such a great number of people in so short a time. It would have taken years to build up that level of mock outrage, anger, or etc. So that's something we'll have to be careful how we use the social media. Just a personal point I would like to make there. Anyway, I must address the big question, unionism and the future. After the Good Friday Agreement, many people from both communities were happy to describe themselves actually as Northern Irish rather than Irish and British. I think that was a hugely important development which should have been seized upon by unionists as an opportunity to create a new and shared identity. Now, I am a unionist, make no apologies for that, but at the same time I'm a realist, I'm a pragmatist, and I'm a Democrat. So, were there a border poll, I would accept being part of United Ireland were it the clear will of the majority of the people here. What percentage? Well, that brings in another issue, 50 plus 1. Even Seamus Mallon was a little bit dubious about that, but that's maybe a rabbit hole I don't want to run into this afternoon. However, while more and more people were content to describe themselves as Northern Irish, we see that Brexit has changed the ground rules terribly. And the level of toxicity since Brexit has visibly increased. It was a mess right from the word go, with poor political leadership shown by unionists. Now, it's not the first time unionism has shown poor political leadership, and I'm sure it will not be the last. But the problems which have led to the protocol surely should have been foreseen. Whenever the referendum was mooted, I said, you know, this is going to lead to problems. I'm delighted to say that I did not vote for Brexit. But those who did, those who just followed Boris's big red bus, I think now a lot of them, particularly in Northern Ireland, are wondering had they made the right decision. In all honesty, there was little talk of a border poll prior to Brexit, but now it's something that's very, very high on the news agenda. So, one question, and I will get back to the question of language in a little while. Should we now be planning for a United Ireland? Well, were there a United Ireland tomorrow, or within the next 10 years, within the next 20 years, I predict that the country will have a sullen and resentful minority. Only this time, it will be a Protestant unionist, sullen and resentful minority. There could be loyalist violence. If we are to move forward, we really need to sensibly address the issue of flags, symbols, etc., anthem. All of those questions need to be resolved well in advance. And then, of course, what sort of a structure? Well, again, it's probably beyond my remit to talk about that today, so I won't. But to summarise the position of unionism at the minute, unionism feels under siege. For a very, very long time, unionism felt confident. That was whenever the demographics were great, unionism went there. We don't have to worry about outreaching to Catholics. But all is not lost for unionism, because now is the time for courageous thinking and leadership. Northern Ireland will not be sustainable without buy-in from Catholics, and unionism has to realise this. I think that Peter Robinson, former leader of the DUP, did grasp that concept a number of years ago when he spoke strongly about the need for outreach. He hinted at integrated education and many other things, but unfortunately those ideas were never followed through. Now surely is the time, if unionism wants to continue and survive in Northern Ireland as part of the United Kingdom. Curiously though, something that many unions detest, the Northern Ireland Protocol, could be the saving grace, because the protocol, once modified and implemented, and I've no doubt it will be modified and implemented to suit the unionist parties as well. It'll just be a cosmetic exercise, a little bit of a change of name, little tweak here and there, and a little ironing out of the issues. Whenever that is fully in place, then perhaps unionism will see that actually it gives Northern Ireland tremendous advantages over this part of the island, tremendous advantages over the rest of the United Kingdom, puts Northern Ireland in prime position for worldwide trade and investment. That's an opportunity that's waiting, but unfortunately for some, it's waiting to be discovered. I would say that whatever the coming years bring, let us keep our eyes on the need for reconciliation and rapprochement in our divided society. Our peace was hard won, and we must all, whatever our politics, do nothing to take us back to the dark days of the gun and bomb. Sadly, there are still some lunatics on both sides who would be very, very happy to do that. Actually, walking through Dublin, walking from Amiens Street today, but of course you know what I mean, I'm only joking. On a building shutter, saw scrawled or graffiti IRA 2022. What does that mean? I wonder. Is there any need to write that like that anymore? Anyway, as I said, our peace was hard won, and we must do our best to maintain the peace. Whatever happens in the future, be it in Northern Ireland or in a united Ireland, we must build a place where everyone can belong and feel at home. Can Irish be part of a shared future in either scenario? I like to think so, but it's going to take time. It's going to take a lot of time. I'm going to return to the original question to close. Why would loyalists choose to learn Irish? Well, I can think of many reasons. Place names. Most Orange lodges are named after the townland where they're based, and the majority of those are wonderful Irish names. Drumnahunchin, the Ridge of the Ash, for example. Now, that one I must mention actually, because many years ago there was a debate in one of the local councils about place names in Irish, and a DUP from a unionist party. A guy from the DUP debate about place names, and he stood up, and it was this debate about starting to rename places and streets and all in Irish. And he stood up after this very lengthy debate and said, "Mr. Mayor, over my dead body, well, they put Irish on Drumnahunchin." Anyway, as I said, yes, Irish can be part of the shared future. Place names, surnames, my name, Malcolm, good sound Protestant name. Investigate Owen MacGillicolin, son of the servant of Columkill. And so many of us have those. And also, plain curiosity might lure Protestants from a working class background towards the Irish language as well. There are signs of development. Unfortunately, the whole post-Brexit debate has poisoned the atmosphere. But a number of years ago, before COVID, I was actually involved in a wonderful initiative in Lurgan, my hometown, to bring together the local Protestant secondary school, grammar school, and the Catholic grammar school for a little cultural enrichment programme. There were 4 classes in Irish: Ulster, Scots, surnames, place names, etc. It went really well. We did 2 weeks. I was almost out in the car, ready to go down for the 3rd week, and I got a phone call: "Ian, don't come down today." because the COVID outbreak meant that all classes were cancelled. So COVID stymied something that had got great potential for the future. Also at that stage, there's a wonderful community centre in Lurgan on the Protestant side, and I was on the verge of teaching Irish classes to loyalists in there. After an awful lot of local level negotiation through some wonderful people, had to talk to some local gatekeepers, but we finally got the go ahead. That was ready to go. Fortunately, it was stymied by COVID. And the atmosphere has become so poisonous in the years since because of Brexit and the protocol that it's unlikely they will take place for the foreseeable future. But things were happening, and things were nearly happening. I believe it can happen again, but we need a generosity of spirit on all sides, as well as a proactive approach. But more than anything else, we need patience. Beautiful Irish proverb yet again. That's also in English, so it's not exclusive to Irish. But this always rings well with me in a context like this. Mar a capel agus yoper fair, which means live horse and you will get grass. In other words, be patient, bide your time. I'm going to finish in Irish. Whatever we do, caithimid a yellow lichela. Whatever we do, we must learn to do it together. And Gurmay of Asham. Would you like a little Oran Anish? Okay. Now, in the time I've been sitting here or standing here in the hall, my ukulele, which was carefully tuned, has probably gone out of tune. But that's okay, because I sing out of tune as well. Two out of tune things together, and it might just work. I'm going to sing a little song. This is not the one that I did in the GPO a couple of years ago, which was a song about a marching dispute in Lurgan during the days of Daniel O'Connell, believe it or not. But I'm going to do something different today. But I have a feeling that you might know this. You know the tune, Annie? I'll just find the key. So, no, we'll do it a different strum, okay? Is Horace Jack and Jeelish me, is McCucky Haran Word. No, I'm going to start again, actually, because I'm doing that the wrong key altogether. Right, here we go, but I think you know what I'm at now. Is Horace Jack and Jeelish me, is McCucky Haran Word. Rinkus the cusses, Kjola McCree, or Blinder, Bay McHer, or a Rinne, Sanna Shin, Vado, Yanni Jingle, Mararby. On 12th this evening, long this Ash me father more. Tashi Shan, Tashi Ali, lays it from Merman Rim, Barnaby in their Ennish Capel, and boy. Such rim, while a broad and tight Mahari, go look for the Shire of War. And 12th this evening, long this such me father war. Probably too many verses for you, but I think I'll
on a special he talking about development of Irish. He said there's no reason why children in the Sandy Row in the future will not be able to curse the Pope in Ireland. The only difference being that the curses will be much more full and meaningful in Irish than they were in English. So anyway, thank you very much, Ian, and the other two speakers. Perhaps you'd all like to join us up here, and we'll open the meeting to the floor. Anyone who wishes to speak, if they just do so. Try and keep comments down perhaps to 5 minutes, not the ubiquitous 10 we've been enjoying. And we'll try and take as many as possible. And maybe a lot of contributions first of all, and then we'll see what sort of replies are required.